Hello, everyone, and welcome to NYC Builds Bio virtual tour of Hudson Research Center and 125 West End Avenue, being developed by Taconic Partners. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nancy Kelly, and I serve on the steering committee and as a founding member of NYC Builds Bio Plus. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our founding and corporate members of the organization who make all of our programming possible. I would also like to thank Taconic Partner, a corporate member of NYC Builds Bio, who is transforming the urban landscape and revitalizing neighborhoods throughout New York City, defining how we live, work, consume, and connect. Two of their most recent projects, Hudson Research Center and 125 West End Avenue, are the cornerstones of the emerging life science subcluster on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson Research Center at 619 West 54th Street is a 322,000 square foot mixed-use building, originally built in 1930 as a film editing house for Warner Brothers Pictures, came to be known as the Movie Lab Building. Now known as the Hudson Research Center, the building is a hub for innovation and collaboration for the burgeoning New York City life sciences sector. 125 West End Avenue is an 8-story, 400,000 square foot building at 125 West End Avenue, obviously. Previously built by the Chrysler Motor Company, the property is now poised to become a state-of-the-art, purpose-built research and laboratory complex. Building on Taconic's previous experience and knowledge, 125 West End Avenue will join Mount Sinai's Clinical and Research Center and MIT professor Neri Oxman's Research and Design Lab for Material Ecology in the former Packard Motors building to mark the next milestone in the growth of Manhattan's West Side life sciences cluster. Our speakers today include Matt Ware, Executive Vice President, Taconic Partners, Jonathan Schifrin, Senior Vice President, CBRE, Chan Lung, Assistant Vice President, Taconic Partners, Jeff Wallerstein, Chief Financial Officer, New York Stem Cell Foundation, Nate Bliss, Vice President, Taconic Partners, Matt Malone, Principal, Perkins & Will, and Lauren Pavlat, Associate at Jarris Baum & Balls. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar is part of an ongoing series of online events hosted by NYC Builds Bio. You can view the series on the event page on our website. Please register for our future monthly webinars in July. Our member spotlight shines on Boston Properties, one of our new members, who will share with us their extensive life science experience and plans for New York City. Also in July, C16 Biosciences will talk to us about their move from NYU Biolabs to 19,000 square feet of R&D space at Hudson Research Center. Mark your calendars for an in-person tour on October 13th of Deerfield Management's 345 Park Avenue South called The Cure. And stay tuned for an announcement of the 2021 Annual Life Science Real Estate Symposium in late October or early November. We hope you will join us in all of this rich programming. Before I begin, I just want to cover a few administrative details. There's a program and PowerPoint highlighting the hosts and speakers for this meeting. These will be posted on the website after the meeting. The program is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants after the meeting. If anyone's having technical difficulties accessing the Zoom room or other issues, please email info@nycbuildsbio.org or send a notice through the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Since most of you are participating in listen-only mode, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will open up for discussion and Q&A at the end of the program, and will address as many of the audience questions as possible. At the end of the meeting, we will also have a chance for smaller randomized groups to meet in separate rooms where you can open your videos and microphones to talk to each other. You can stay as long as you would like to get to know each other or share stories. Now I'll open it up to Matt Weir, Executive Vice President, Taconic Partners, who will introduce these exciting developments for all of us. Matt?
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks to your team for having us here today. Nate, do you want to go ahead and tee everything up, and then we can jump into the presentation?
Sure, absolutely. Christina, why don't you just go to the next slide? So as far as agenda today, Nancy covered it well. We wanted to introduce ourselves at Taconic Partners, cover the market as our esteemed colleagues at CBRE are experiencing it, and then really take you through a journey on two of our assets within the West Side subcluster, Hudson Research Center and 125 West End. We'll have time to wrap up in Q&A, and as Nancy says, as the presentation continues, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We'd love to make this conversational. So with that, I'm going to punt it back to Matt. Actually, on the next slide, we'll introduce ourselves, team members representing Taconic, a subsection of the folks involved on our life science portfolio. Very pleased to be the representatives of our firm today, speaking on behalf of these projects. Matt?
Thank you, Nate. So as Nancy said, Matt Weir, I'm an executive vice president here at Taconic. Been with the firm for 15 years, and Taconic been around since '97. And if you want to jump to the next slide, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves as they get to their sections. But Taconic has been in business since '97. We're a New York City focused developer, landlord, operator. As you can see on the screen, these are a few of the projects, but we essentially are active in all segments of the market. Obviously, life science is now a major component of that. But one sort of illustrative segment that we were very active in was telecom and data centers. And so 111 8th, which is now the home to Google, had a major component of that. And sort of long story short, significant amounts of mission critical infrastructure, which is analogous to life science. In either case, we are vertically integrated. So we develop our own properties, we manage our properties, we're very active in leasing and all other components of our operation. And again, these are some representative projects that we have done in New York City. I oversee our commercial portfolio and have been very active in pushing our commitment, our activity and our development of life sciences for the past 4 or 5 years. And it started with the Hudson Research Center, which you're going to hear more detail about in a minute. If you want to go to the next slide, to talk sort of high level, you know, Taconic is at this point one of the most active developers in New York City, specifically in life sciences. We have all told over 500,000 square feet of lab space under construction at this very moment. At HRC, which Chun will be telling you some more details of, that space is delivering much sooner. We have a good chunk of space delivering, just over 32,000 feet, delivering late summer, early fall. The next wave of space, or the next phase of space, will come about 8 to 10 months after that. And then the final phase of what is 100,000 feet at HRC shortly thereafter. And then, as Nate will tell you more about, 125 is in active construction at the moment, and that'll deliver in early 2023. So we have a lot on the board, and we're not sort of stopping there. We are still actively seeking out other investments in life sciences, specifically here in New York. So that sort of, you know, shows our commitment and our belief in this market really taking off. If you want to jump into the next slide, please. As we've talked about quite a bit, Nancy, on these programs, you know, here are some of the statistics that really sort of answer the question of why New York City, why do firms like ours have conviction around this industry here in New York City. And I think at this point, these are all fairly well known. I'll highlight just a few things. The number one, the largest life science workforce in the country here in the New York MSA, that is perhaps the largest key, not only to this story, but any story, is the talent factor. the labor statistics. The other thing I'll say is 2020 was a record year globally for funding into life science. And it was a record year for New York, which does receive its fair share of both public and private financing. And CBRE may touch more on this, but we're coming off of record years. There was momentum pre-COVID. I think the story of the trajectory accelerating during COVID is one that's well understood. So it's a very exciting time for New York right now. A couple of other things, the Partnership for New York published a report in the last month or so. I found it interesting that they've quantified that there's 54 companies per year that are being started in New York. Not all of those will jump into lab space day one, but that's I think an interesting number to really demonstrate the amount of commercial activity that is coming either out of our academic institutions or starting here for other strategic reasons. So again, I'll keep this rather brief because we want to sort of get to the good stuff as it were, but it's a very exciting time for New York. We often kind of refer to this as really a launch point for our life science industry here. And obviously we're at the forefront of that with our developments that are underway. Next slide, please. As Nancy sort of alluded to in the intro, you know, it's no coincidence that our two active projects are 10 blocks from each other. We're obviously focused right now on the West Side cluster, but we, you know, while we're on the West Side, we're proximate to the workforce in Jersey and up in Westchester, Long Island, Connecticut, et cetera. But we're also very proximate to the other institutions and other clusters here in the city. But we are, as we mentioned, currently developing 500,000 feet in this specific West Side cluster. And when we're all done, it'll house around 700,000 square feet of lab space. That's in addition to the space that we're currently under construction on. We have existing lab space at HRC, and you'll be hearing from one of our most important tenants and clients, the New York Stem Cell Foundation, here in a moment. But obviously, we're really excited about the critical mass that's coming to the West Side, not only with what we're doing, but also Mount Sinai, Georgetown, and others that are active in the market. Next slide. So with that, I will now turn it over to my colleagues to do a deeper dive into the market, as well as the projects. And the last thing I will say is, in addition to these two, we are still very actively seeking out opportunities. Let that sort of represent our commitment and our thoughts for the potential growth and future growth of the industry here in New York. So thank you.
Next slide, and Jonathan, please take it away.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to talk about the market a little bit. I just have a couple of slides, and then I think Chun will take it over and dive into the Hudson Research Center. But on the outset, the one thing that I would like to say is that the state of the life science market in New York is strong. I think if you flip to the next slide, we have a couple of stats on that. Our team, you know, we've been in the market for a number of years, 5-6 years. You know, when we came into New York, you know, there were a couple of institutional locations. You know, obviously some couple of buildings over on the east side, but we really didn't see a lot of momentum in the market. All the demand drivers were there, and Matt touched on some of them. You know, from funding, from employment. If you look at the top graph, the New York City life science VC funding. In 2014, you know, $44 million is really not a lot, you know, compared to some of the other major cities across the country. And the one thing that we like to point to is the ratio of public to private investment. So starting in 2013, for every dollar of NIH funding that came into New York City, that only generated 6 cents of VC funding, which is obviously a very small amount when you compare it to, you know, let's say Boston, Massachusetts, or California. That number has ballooned to now in 2020 to 73 cents. So every NIH dollar that comes into Manhattan generates 73 cents of VC funding, you know, which is an incredible trend line for the city, and I think is an indication of you know, more to come, future growth. We're working on some numbers right now. The folks up in Boston try and compute what those VC dollars actually translate to for absorption on an actual square foot basis. And again, the numbers look really good. In this year alone, in 2020, we will have outpaced currently the total amount of leasing that we have done over the past couple of years by a wide margin. If you go back to 2018, the number of leasing, and that's really when the incubators came online. So kind of the three, larger incubators that we have in the city: Launch Labs, Biolabs, and J Labs. We were doing just about 50,000 square feet of leasing. We've done almost 300,000 square feet to date. And it looks like we could hit 500,000, again, all kind of banner numbers for New York. From an NIH funding standpoint, the gap between New York City and Boston was almost $1 billion if you go back to 2011, and that number has shrunk on that bottom chart, if you see that, to just 22 million, which is pretty incredible to think. We are a market, if you want to flip to the next slide, with just under 2 million square feet of lab space to date, compared to a market in Boston, that is upwards of 30, 35 million square feet. And the NIH dollars that we have flowing into the market are basically on par. Obviously, the supply pipeline, is going to grow pretty significantly, over the next couple of years, and kudos certainly to Taconic, and the projects that they have, that I really think kind of accelerated that. If you go back to 619 West 54th Street, delivering that first piece of space that we did, which wound up going to Hybercell, and I know you're going to see some pictures of it coming up, was to me really the catalyst that I think, has propelled the market, really allowing people to see what lab space could look like in New York, the fact that we could deliver it, the fact that it doesn't necessarily need to have, all of the perfect infrastructure components like 14-foot clear ceiling heights that you would find in other markets, but that we could deliver quality lab space that could allow companies growing in New York, being funded in New York, being run by people in New York to grow and flourish. Over the next couple of years, we're going to see some growth in the pipeline, but I think one of the nice things to point out about that pipeline is that a lot of that growth is measured and paced out. So we are not in a situation where you're getting a dump of 2 million square feet kind of all at once. You've got some large scale projects like a 125 West End Avenue coming online, in the next, call it, year and a half. There's some other large scale projects that are going on in other parts of the city that kind of on the whole, make up a really nice New York City cluster, provide tenants in the market, with different locations adjacent to different academic medical institutions and hospital networks, like you would find in most other markets. But that the pace of leasing, is really kind of moving as these buildings are delivering. We are in discussions with a couple of large users. The one other thing that I would say, and I think it really speaks to kind of the market, is, when we started, a number of years ago, most of the deals that we were doing, most of the tenants that we were talking to were really early stage tenants, coming out of incubators, groups, pre-revenue, very hard to underwrite those companies. And one of the biggest shifts has now been the fact that, we are having discussions, at a variety of buildings with larger scale institutions, better credit tenants, the institutions, the academic institutions. I think the Mount Sinai deal, that got done recently was kind of a good indication of that. The fact that space will have a large proportion of lab space in it. And I think all of these things together, point to New York being a real bright spot around the country for, the coming years.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. Why don't we turn into the properties now? And so let me introduce my colleague, Chun, who will introduce himself and our work at Hudson Research Center.
Hey, everybody. My name is Chun. I've been with Taconic for a little over 3 years. I'm the asset manager of the Hudson Research Center at 619 West 54th Street. Taconic purchased the property back in 2012, and we brought in our partner Silverstein Properties in 2017. The 619 West 54th Street was previously known as the Movie Lab building. It was a manufacturing building, 32,000 square foot floor plates with excellent floor loads. It's 320,000 square feet. of which currently 80,000 square feet is for life science use. We have another 100,000 square feet of life science space that we're bringing online over the next 16 months. It's currently the home of the New York Stem Cell Foundation and Hybricell, and it will be the future home of C16 Biosciences. On the next slide, we'll take a quick look at a couple images of the Stem Cell Foundation. And I don't think we can really talk about Taconic and life science without really talking about the history that we have with the Stem Cell Foundation. Back in 2015, when we met the Stem Cell Foundation, we didn't really know as much about life sciences. And while we were negotiating the lease with them and their mechanical engineer, JB&B, we really started to, a light bulb moment flashed when, Matt alluded to our history with 111/8 telecom data centers and robust mechanical systems. And that's when we kind of, looked deeper into life sciences and how we can kind of build these spaces and bring them quickly to the market. And, a lot of when the Stem Cell Foundation came into Hudson Research Center, a lot that they looked into were, floor loads, zoning requirements, redundancy, access to roof space for large mechanical systems, access to shaft space. And these were all attributes that 619 West 54th Street had. So after that, if you go on the next slide, this is another shot of the Hudson Research Center. That kind of brought us into our next piece, which was raising some equity so that we could build out our own pre-built lab space, which you'll see on the next slide. So this is the 8th floor lab that we built back in 2019. This is leased to Hybricell, and everything that you see in here was purchased and designed by, it was purchased by us, everything including FF&E, all the furniture that you see in there, the full build out. It was designed by Perkins & Will and BR+A, and it was built by Taliesin. And this was, why don't you go to the next slide? As you kind of see through here, we took a lot of the lessons learned with the New York Stem Cell Foundation, and we took, the pieces that Taconic does best, which is office, and we kind of blended it together into this lab space. It's a 50-50 lab to office split. Next slide, please. And in it, everything, above the panels, you'll see all the plugins for all the lab gas, all the bench tops were provided by us, and all the tenant specific equipment was purchased by Hybricell, but it was easily tapped into the design that Perkins & Will put together so that it was really modular and Hybricell could come in day one, lay out their space and be operational as soon as possible. Next slide, please. This is another look through the glass into the pantry through the lab space. There's a lot of good light and air into that lab space that comes through the office. Next slide, please. This is a view in the conference room where it has a demountable glass partition that kind of can be opened up into an all hands room. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, we have a very exciting addition to the Hudson Research Center, C16. They will be moving in shortly after we finish the design and construction later this year. Next slide, please. And this is a little bit of the construction progress. This is the actual 7th floor where we are building out right now. You can see that we have some studs up. That top image, that is actually where the future lab of C16 will be. And then on the bottom image, that's another view looking into the lab corridor. On the next slide, you'll see the test fit, the actual build layout of the 7th floor lab that we're delivering in a couple months. And on the plan left, that is the C16 space. It's 19,000 square feet. It has southern exposures of DeWitt Clinton Park. And then on the west, we have the Hudson River. Both of these, there's tremendous light and air that kind of goes into these floor plates and into these lab spaces. And then on the northern unit, which is in the red box, that is a 13,000 square foot space that's still available. And then on the next slide, we have a video of the rendering of the 7th floor lab as well as the amenity space, which we're bringing online. And with that, I'll pass on our tenant, the New York Stem Cell Foundation, and Jeff Wallerstein.
I think there's another slide. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Wallerstein. I'm the Chief Financial and Operating Officer of the New York Stem Cell Foundation. I've been with, I just want to thank NYC Builds Bio Plus and Taconic Partners for giving me a few minutes to talk about NYCIF, as we call it. We've been in business since 2005. I've been with the organization since then on our founder, Susan Solomon's kitchen table when we were writing the business plan for the New York Stem Cell Foundation. And we started out building labs in the Audubon Biotech Center on 166th Street and set up offices on 68th and Broadway. And as we continued to grow, we knew we needed to find a home where we can all be together. And so we searched with our brokers, CBRE, Gary Kamenetsky, looked all over, looked for a building that could handle, those of you who know us, we have a lot of equipment. We needed to lay it out properly. And so we wanted a large floor plate and all the attributes that Chun talked about in the building at 619. So we found 619. We wanted to stay on the west side since we had a west side kind of footprint, and our employees were a lot on the west side, northern Manhattan. We loved the bike path coming down. So as Chun said, we did have a little education with Taconic about the needs of life sciences, and we were able to negotiate and successfully and take the third floor, as you can see here, as pre-construction, and a sliver of the second floor. And it really has been working great for us. At that time, we engaged Eniad as architects, JB&B as our engineers, Hunter Roberts to be the construction managers. And we leased up in November, and we moved in January and February of 2017. We had really an accelerated timeline, and everybody worked hard to deliver it because we needed to be out of the Audubon Biotech Center in February of 2017. And we never wanted to be down. We have live human cells that we work with here. And so we always had to have an incubator or two or a freezer plugged in. But the building worked through a lot of the needs that we needed and was very accommodating to us to put in the infrastructure that we needed. We built a building within a building here. And things like backup power, which Taconic is our experts in, came to a great solution. We were going to put in our own, just for an example, we were going to put in our own backup generator. And they decided that it would be better to have one massive one and that we could lease space from. And other assets that we put into the building, actually Taconic's benefiting from some of those also. And so as we continue to grow, and maybe the next slide can show you a little bit about what it looks like. Chun shows some pictures. We've built out our labs. One exciting thing that we did to the space during COVID, we were deemed an essential workplace by the National Eye Institute, was that we built out a clean room so we can actually make clinical grade cells with the help of Taliesin Construction that helped build the room during COVID. And again, be able to deliver it relatively on time and in budget was quite a feat during COVID. But now it's fully operational, it's qualified, and we are doing biology in that room. We have a project with Columbia University to work on macular degeneration to make actually the cells in the eye that people lose when they have macular degeneration. So we have been continuing to grow and expanding our research projects and starting to outgrow the space that we moved into in 2017. So I called Matt actually and asked him if the tenant on the second floor really needed all their space, and it kind of was a win-win because they were a mortuary school that didn't need all their space because even pre-COVID, their classes were going online. So we were able to negotiate and take the balance of the second floor that we didn't already have. On our second floor, I don't have a picture of it, sorry. It's a very nice like eating and meeting space. And we would love to have this meeting there maybe in a few months when things really open up. But we have other programs where we have educational type programs, we have panel discussions, we're a convener. And that's why 619 really worked for us, because it was very accessible. And we collaborate with everybody, so everyone can come visit us, and we love that. So as we continue to grow, we look to expand our labs and office space on the second floor. And there's just a picture on the next slide of just the diagram that actually ENIAD has helped us with the planning, and JB&B, and Hunter Roberts is helping us with some estimating to figure out the best use of the second floor and the third floor. And we also got a nice award from the New York City Economic Development Corporation recently for $6.5 million of equipment that we are excited about using and building the right facility for that equipment. I don't know if there's any questions or anything that more I could say.
That's terrific, Jeff.
Thanks, Nate.
Thank you very much. So that's going to wrap it up for Hudson Research Center. But before we move on, let me just underscore, none of this is possible without the full ecosystem that is our partners, our design teams, our engineers, our construction consultants, and of course our tenants, which is really what it's all about. And the groundbreaking research that folks like the New York Stem Cell Foundation is doing is one of the most inspiring things about being in this line of work. So really appreciate it. Thank you for sharing, Jeff. And let's go to our next project on the next slide. So this is 125 West End Avenue. I'm going to pull in Lauren and Matt Malone on this, respectively, from JB&B, our esteemed MEP engineer, and Perkins & Will, our design firm, design lead on this project. And let me also open by acknowledging the partners who have similarly built some conviction in the life science market and its potential, and are alongside us building this project, a 400,000 spec life science lab ready building, and what will be the single largest delivery of new lab space in a single building since Alexandria went up on the east side. So, you know, a project at scale, and one that we think is an important milestone in the collective efforts everyone on this call, including the Builds Bio team, have worked on for years, which is building this industry in New York City. So 125 West End, if you go to the next slide, just like to start with the history of these buildings. Similar to our Hudson Research Center asset, which was a movie lab. This one has a previous life also that's quite interesting. It was built by the Chrysler Corporation as, at the time, what was considered a state-of-the-art service center. So right off the bat, you can see some of the things that inspired us about this building, which harken back to that original construction: large floor load capacity, great ceiling heights, and a building that was designed to actually take vehicles all the way up to the top of the building, to the roof, which is not in our redevelopment plans, but is yet nevertheless something that we're going to take advantage of. And we'll show you a little bit about how. On the next slide, just another image of its original construction. And I think that's a Chrysler Imperial in the image. And you see the Helix ramp, which is what we branded it at least, which was the automotive ramp that takes you all the way up the building. But on the next slide, you get a sense of how we're intending to transform this asset, really fully transform it from what was its industrial roots to something that, ideally is a stake in the ground for an industry that we all are hoping to grow further in the New York City market, and that's the life sciences sector. So you can see here a little glimpse, and I'll share more details about what a transformed 125 West End will look like. New curtain wall, brand new facade, completely reskinned building, and taken down to its essential concrete elements and essentially rebuilt as a modern life science facility. On the next slide, it's just a bit of a summary of what we're aiming to accomplish with this project, and what we think are some of the distinguishing features of the property. One of the things I'll talk more about are how we are leaning into the original loading strategies of this building and making use of them, repurposing them for a life science application. And we are also taking advantage of some of the unique topography of this site and its frontage on multiple exposures to create some building within building opportunities that we think are pretty interesting. All in all, we are in the ground on this project, so to say. We are 3 months into a construction schedule, actually 4 months, if I'm counting correctly. We recapped this project with our new equity partner, LaSalle, and closed on construction financing with Apollo and Oaktree in March. And so we are building this project. And I should say, we're not just building the core and shell, we are building out the lab supporting infrastructure to make these lab ready spaces. And we are going to be delivering a full fit out program as well for a first floor, the third floor, which I'll get to. And Matt Malone is going to show us some sneak peek, never before seen images of some of our design work in progress. So next slide. You know, the New York City market as it's evolving and the different subclusters are quite interesting. And ultimately, I think New York City's is going to evolve in a way, its sectors will evolve in a way that's very different than what's happened in other cities, partially because our transportation system is so robust and it's very easy to get from sort of one facility or institution to the other. That said, these subclusters we think are relevant and important, and we're excited about what's happening on the west side, not just with our products and our properties, but with some other key deliveries in the neighborhood. And that coupled with some of the institutional presence from everything from Fordham to Lincoln Center and of course Mount Sinai West really make it an interesting place to think about further expansion of the sector. On the next slide, get into a little bit of the delivery strategy here. I mentioned complete gut renovation, designing all of our systems with the help of our design team to anticipate the requirements of future lab tenants. Our new facade is not just an aesthetic improvement, but it's a performance improvement from a thermal perspective. We're building a new lobby, which we'll again show you a sneak peek of here, and bringing in on an amenity program that includes roof terrace and conference center space. Really, these projects come down to infrastructure most critically, and we've spent a lot of time studying and anticipating those needs and designing our systems accordingly. We'll talk about the drive-in and loading. And finally, I think there's a tension that's been flagged on previous NYC Builds Bio panels about environmental sustainability, carbon emissions, and the heavy energy requirements out of these facilities. Something we really tackled head on, and Lauren's going to speak a little bit more about our strategies around that. We are excited to be tracking LEED, as well as Fitwell, and most recently Wired Score Platinum on this project. So important features of our renovation. Next slide. I won't dwell on this, but a bit of the kind of what it takes to convert a lab building and some of the key metrics that we've been tracking, everything from load capacity to column spacing to slab ceiling heights, and of course designing our centralized MEP systems to the lab needs, thinking about emergency generated power and HVAC systems, building out central acid neutralization systems, other things that mean the building will be set up and won't need to go through a repositioning process with every tenant. We have adequate supply and adequate capacity to support the tenant of the building. Next. So I'll take you through just a few images, but starting with the stacking plan. It's a 7-story plus basement, but the basement is actually accessible at ground level on our 66th Street frontage, 54,000 square foot plates, and direct load-in access at 3 levels, the basement, the first floor, the second floor, and even the 3rd floor. Next slide. So a cut through of the building. Now I've taken off the facade that we spent so much time working on, but just for illustrative purposes. This is looking back towards Central Park. And you see a little bit of how we're taking the bones of this project and the bones of this building and repurposing them for a life science use. At the lowest part of your screen, you see our loading dock and loading driveway, access directly off 66th Street with space for 7+ truck berths, including 3 dedicated to the building and dedicated tenant storage abilities. Above that is a viaduct ramp that was constructed by Chrysler to allow cars to then access the central auto ramp, which you see in the middle of your frame, which again goes all the way up the building, which after much consideration and tense debate with our design team, Matt Malone will attest, we have decided to retain and incorporate as a feature with breakout conference spaces and what we think will be some pretty distinguishing and unique space in the building. Next slide.
Nate, actually, if I might just jump in and make one comment, absolutely. If you want to go back to the previous slide with loading. You know, the other point I think about the loading, you know, and this is one of the more distinguishing features about the building, you know, is the fact that we can provide, you know, like Nate said, loading on multiple levels, and also with the amount of loading bays that you see in the building, individual tenants can have their own individual loading bays. We can provide complete and total chain of custody for certain tenants, you know, where they can retain total control of everything that goes in and out of their space, you know, 100% control, as well as, you know, provide the ability for certain tenants to do some light scale biomanufacturing, you know, within their space, you know, without really an issue. And that's one thing that we've seen a lot of. I'm sure, you know, many people on the call, you know, have been hearing about kind of the onshoring of biomanufacturing. You know, there's kind of a push for some small scale biomanufacturing to happen by individual tenants being able to kind of control, you know, that preclinical manufacturing that gets done and not necessarily have to outsource that to other groups. So it's a really unique feature about the building, and I think, you know, one that kind of you know, needs to and should be highlighted, you know, throughout the presentation.
We get excited when our brokerage team gets excited, and when tenants that we present this are getting excited. So it's all happening. Let me run through a few more slides and then make sure we're leaving enough time for Matt and Lauren's piece. So let's go to the next. So this is the Helix space repurposed, and one of our various concepts for what can be done, which will be informed by tenanting plans and tenanting preferences for the space. I'll let Matt speak to this a little bit more about what it looks like in a multi-tenant scenario. Next slide. And so let me just spin through quickly some of the floor plans. The basement level includes, as Jonathan was mentioning, those potentials for dedicated tenant loading areas and tenant storage. We're also planning a full conference center at this facility, which we hope will be able to host future NYC Builds Bio events and really help, coupled with what's already happening in the sector, really grow out this cluster. Showers, locker rooms, and other amenities down here as well. Next slide. So moving up the building, this is one of our layouts for our first floor, showing lab and office configuration. Each floor is set up to take both a lab and office program. And as I'll show, some of the upper floors could actually be 100% lab or 100% office, depending on the needs of the tenant. Next slide. Up on the second floor, we have the opportunity with some of the loading to have, as Jonathan mentioned, a direct drive-in private loading bay, which is shown in the hatch at the plan upper left of this plan. And what we've heard is great feedback about this being well suited for potentially diagnostics tenants or any similar sort of unbrokered chain of custody type users. And if we go up the building next, you'll see some sample floor plans for a 50-50 office lab layout. Or on the next slide, you can see what a full lab layout will look like. Again, potentially with a connecting element of the helix itself or through the other vertical circulation to a floor that could be 100% office, just one up or one down. So as we're designing the core and shell of this building and anticipating a delivery in 2023, we've been stress testing ourselves against all of these different configurations to meet a variety of different tenant needs. And on the next slide, just taking you up to the roof, we think it's important to amenitize these spaces. This is really something that we look at across the entire Taconic commercial portfolio. So here you'll see our rooftop terrace, and on the next slide, just to tease everybody with a little bit of what this could look like if we do it in person in a few years. This is our Hudson River view, looking out from the roof terrace, the portion of the roof that is not otherwise dedicated to the mechanical systems to support this building, which I'm sure Lauren will touch on. So let me not use any more time and turn it to our partner, Matt. Just again, want to acknowledge these projects cannot happen without the efforts of so many, including many I see on this call, lawyers and environmental consultants and the like. So thank you to everybody involved in this project. And Matt, why don't you take it over?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Nate. I think, I want to start just simply by saying a lot of times we talk about all of the tech specs of these buildings. What's the column spacing? What's the clear height of the underside of structure? And those are all incredibly valuable. I know we've all focused a lot on them as why it is that a building is more suitable. But what I think is particularly interesting about this opportunity, and I think what made a couple of comments that resonated with me, for example, Jonathan mentioned that 14-foot clear is not what we're necessarily going to see all the time in New York City. What I think is incredibly interesting about this project is that we are, reutilizing an existing building. And I think that there's a really, really positive story to come from that. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on a little bit, is we don't always consider when we talk about these things, I know we consider them as we're doing them, but we don't always consider when we talk about these things, other aspects of the design that go beyond the numbers, if you will, of the technical specifications of the building. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that. I think, I want to, if you don't mind jumping to the next slide, I think some of the quicker things to discuss that maybe are a little bit underemphasized. What's interesting to me about this and the West Side cluster that we're talking about is the location of this building. This building on 66th Street, I want to underline it. 66th Street is a two-way street that goes through the park and connects us directly with all of the institutions on the east side. So as far as connectivity, it's actually really well connected to the east side Bedpan Alley or the hospital corridor that exists over on First and York in that area. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of that. And it kind of starts, getting us into the conversation of cross-town traffic, if you will, cars, vehicles, and the history of this building. Something that while we wanted to reinvent this building, we also wanted to tip the cap or have a nod to its history. We wanted to make sure that we were trying to find a way to embrace both of those things, because it is a really interesting aspect of the story. So I think, it's important that when we start to think about what this building could be, we start to think about some of the greatest, technical entrepreneurs of the day, for example, like in Elon Musk. We know that gentleman because he's developing automobiles. So all of a sudden you start to look at this and you say, okay, automobiles are a thing here. What is it about cars? So if we go to the next slide, you start to see what we really kind of distilled that down to. And it was about, for us, it's about rotation. It's about movement. It's about how can we take that metaphor of the automobile and utilize it for a completely new typology here in that we're developing as a typology in New York City, which is the commercial laboratory building. And so it's about, for us, it's about movement, it's about rotation, it's about these recurring elements. The building itself embodies change. The industry itself embodies change, different ways of doing things. It's got to stay progressive. It's got to stay in motion. What we did was we pulled in some components, design cues throughout the building that are all about that movement, whether they be ramped or they be curvilinear, and they all have a consistent materiality that harkens back to that story. And I think that's something we were trying to bring to this and carry through. Next slide, please. So I think, you know, the idea of entering into this space, and this is an existing space, the ceiling structure itself, the existing, but how do we address that, reclad it, but not lose sight of what it once was? The space itself is curvilinear. What we did was we lowered the floor a little bit in this case in order to get us a higher ceiling. The idea being we could, you know, have a more gracious entry as we move into this building. But what it offered us is the opportunity to create, for example, an enormous amount of accessibility, a universal access to this building. So the entrance actually has a feature element to its left-hand side. You can see it on this image. That is a ramp that brings us up the elevation as well. And that's that kind of recurring theme. We highlight that with a wood element in this case to try and, again, identify that as the design element. But again, you'll also see this tech element along the back wall that has a certain kind of a progressive appearance to it. It is a new appearance to this lobby. We've clad the columns in this case. It is, again, a new element to an otherwise existing industrial building. Next slide, please. Additionally, we talk about the idea of generating an ecosystem in these types of environments. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the idea of having in the floor below that lobby, and we have a private entrance that we've introduced in the northeast corner of this building, is an event center or a conferencing center. So again, we introduced this idea of a ramp, this idea of accessibility that becomes a design element. The idea of the wood element that is giving us that hint of, hey, this is that design piece, this is that recurring event. So you could come in directly off the lobby, you can come in directly off the street and find your way down into this event space that ultimately has multiple conference rooms and multiple event spaces, including a space that could house up to 150 people for events down here. Or could, you know, when not in use for events, can be used just simply as a collaborative and social gathering space. So the space itself, as is with the rest of the design, is intended to be a little bit multifunctional, have a degree of flexibility. We always talk about flexibility in laboratory environments. We try to bring that as well as an important component to the design of the spaces that aren't necessarily the laboratories. The idea of having these collaborative spaces, these flexible spaces, was very important to us in the way that we approach the design. You can go to the next slide. So this is a version of what we're calling the helix. So again, you've got this central component where this once vehicular ramp is kind of inclining away from us from the left up to the right. And it is one of those idea spaces where we can collaborate. We can bring, if it's a single tenant, this could become a bit of a focal point or a center point for them, a gathering space for all of the employees of that entity, or in the case of a multi-tenant floor, which is something that we're talking about looking at, and in fact doing some design work now with the intent of building out. This becomes a bit of a shared space, a shared collaborative space, which introduces that ecosystem concept of different entities within this building finding common ground to interact with each other, which we think is incredibly important to generating the draw and the ecosystem that these spaces aspire to. It's going to bring people in because science is all about communication and collaboration in so many ways. And I think it's very important. And as you saw with the work that we did over at the Hudson Research Center, the idea of transparency, the idea of being able to see from the lab to the office, from the office to the lab, and allowing everybody to kind of visually connect and collaborate was also brought here, very important. And again, please bear with us. You know, you've seen a bunch of different images of the same space. This is a work in progress. We are developing this design as we go. I thought about giving an entire new design, but I didn't want to do that to Nate. You'd see him fall over in his chair if I did. But so if you go to the next slide, you get an image of the idea of the helix and how we're engaging this ramp environment. We're in a multi-tenant floor, we're creating these, what we're calling pods, the idea of these pods moving up this ramp, providing us with accessible to the entire floor space that is unassigned but can be signed out for, is an environment that allows the tenants on this floor to have private meetings, but also be a part of a more public environment. And we see this as being really exciting. And when we were debating whether or not we kept that ramp environment, this was some of what we had envisioned, was like, this is an opportunity for us to bring some of the life of the building existing into a new light. And I'll credit Matt Weir for saying he really loved the idea of experiencing the ramp. So we heard that little snippet and ran with it. I said, all right, I'm taking that and I'm running with it. So thank you, Matt, for that opportunity, because we're pretty excited about it, to be honest.
And Matt, we should note here that while not rendered, these spaces will all be fully ADA accessible. There are lift systems and the like. So while vertical, harkening back to its industrial origin, it will be accessible to all.
Without a doubt. Thank you for saying that, Matt. That's entirely true. That was actually very important to us, considering that, we were putting ramps in all over the building. It didn't make sense for us to have a space that wasn't accessible. So of course we took that into account. So with the next slide, you'll see again that curvilinear component, that idea of that materiality that reconnects us to the overall theming that we're trying to bring to the reposition here. So this would be the entrance to a tenant space. So the reception lobby, if you will, of a typical pre-built tenant laboratory environment. The pre-built spaces that we're discussing, again, are employing that 50-50 ratio of laboratory to office. So this is the entryway to that. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the idea of the other side of that curvilinear wall. So now we're in that laboratory environment. Again, the laboratory's flexible casework, the idea of overhead service panels so that we can plug or unplug as necessary, move the piece of casework out of the way, bring a piece of equipment in, reconfigure the laboratory if necessary. So that's the driver there. Again, the flexibility being a key component to that. If you go to the next slide, you start to see on the right-hand side here is that laboratory, and on the left, you'll see all of these communal environments, these collaborative environments that we're putting, immediately within visibility of that laboratory, the glass to the right of the laboratory, from the laboratory into these communal spaces, designed specifically with the intent of allowing for that collaboration to happen without creating, a certain, call it a stress or a tension, if you will, that laboratorians sometimes feel when they leave the lab. I'm not aware of my work. I don't understand who's in there doing something. Well, we're trying to approach that. And I think not just from that visibility for safety factor, but also you're getting an enormous amount of borrowed light, and you've got that constant connectivity between your organization's office functions and laboratory functions. Next slide, please. So this is another example of a similar space, another one of the tenant spaces. To the left, you'll see some more of the collaborative environments, whether that's the pantry and multi-purpose function, a space that could ultimately be opened up, and again, that transformation or flexibility of the space and used for all hands type environments. The office space a little bit to the right in the foreground, and then just in the background of the office space, you see that idea of transparency and glazing looking into the laboratory environment. So there is that connectivity between the two, something that was very important to us in the design approach here. So with that, I will pass over to Lauren, who will discuss a little bit more about our approach to the design and the integration of all of the robust MEP components that a laboratory building requires.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to introduce myself, I'm Lauren Pavlett, an associate at JB&B in the Plumbing and Fire Protection Department. And I have been working closely with Taconic and Perkins & Will now for over a year and a half on both 125 West End Ave core and shell and the fit out portion. So before I dive into engineering specific to 125, if we could go to the next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about Local Law 97 first. Probably a word most of you have heard, if not all of us. Just some background on Local Law 97. New York City enacted this local law as part of the Carbon Mobilization Act. It essentially places a carbon cap on most buildings. These caps begin in 2024 and become more stringent over time. So by 2050, the goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 80%. So now with Local Law 97 in mind, it was very exciting for JB&B to get pulled into both Hudson Research Center and 125 West End Ave with Taconic. Taconic really wanted to embrace Local Law 97 and the reduction of carbon emissions. So it was just a breath of fresh air to work with a client who really understood the bigger picture. Taconic had high aspirations to do better than just the minimum requirements. And they wanted, as you saw in that video on that little notebook, a best-in-class building. So our team was just thrilled to get the opportunity to implement so many new technologies with them and take an innovative approach for reducing carbon emissions. So for instance, here, the image shows an overall plan to reduce carbon emissions by using these 3 buzzwords that I'll keep using: reducing building energy, recycling energy from building systems. So here, recycling, that would mean taking energy from one process and utilizing it elsewhere in the building. I'll give an example later on. And electrifying equipment where applicable. I'll get into reduce and recycling more with 125 HVAC systems, but specific to electrifying HVAC equipment, Hudson Research Center, the first building spoken about, it will actually be the first building in New York City to deploy large-scale air source heat pumps, and that aligns with building electrification heating. So that's just another example alone that just really reinforces our excitement with using new technology with Taconic. So we'll circle back with specifics on how 125 embraces Local Law 97, but let's go to the next slide just to give a good overview of the engineering systems we have. So Nate did a great job of already kind of expressing some of these items, but just to give you a picture, let's start at the bottom. So this laboratory building that has the utmost flexibility for specialty needs is truly meant to be a lab-ready building, not just lab-friendly. We want all the infrastructure in place. And so we really had to work on making sure our infrastructure supported this lab-ready building. We went through an extensive remassing of the building where we leveraged some existing services where it made sense, but for the most part, everything on the MEP side is new. So at that lowest level of the building, we have larger plumbing systems. As mentioned before, they're shown in purple there. So we have our stormwater tank, captures rainwater and releases it out to the street sewer. We also have acid neutralization tanks for all of the waste from the laboratories. We are also leveraging the existing electrical service and the existing steam service for now, but with plans to eventually switch over to air source heat pumps, like on Hudson Research Center. In the center there, you can see we have all our core risers and electrical feeds with capped outlets for tenant use, space planned for fume hood shafts for labs. And then up at the roof, this is where we have the majority of our equipment. So in green, we have our life safety building generator and tenant generator, which I know Jeff mentioned that was a similar thing on 619. Then in blue behind that screen wall shown are the fume hood exhaust fans. And then to note, we are also using DOAS, which stands for Dedicated Outdoor Air System. And those are those orange boxes you see there on the right. And they provide ventilated air to meet code minimum requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So 125 is a first of its kind lab building. Let's go back to how it embraces Local Law 97. If we could go to the next slide, please. All right, we have these 3 words again. So for reduce, I know Nate touched on this, a high performance envelope. The insulation on the facade was upgraded for a better thermal barrier. We are also reducing fan energy by going to DOAS, and that's what I'll get to on the coming slides. Recycle, nothing is wasted. We are using condenser water heat recovery and essentially capturing every last BTU before it leaves the building. And then electrify would be our plans to implement air source heat pumps in the future. So now let's talk about reduce and recycle and exactly what we're doing on 125. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is not the design for 125. This is to give you an idea of what a typical design would be. And then I'll get into the changes that we made. So this is a traditional chiller plant design. I know you've already seen what looks like that helix. I like the little shout out in the chat about it being a reminder of a double helix, like the shape of DNA. And then on each side, the different lab tenants. So let's just pay attention to one of those labs. So it's boxed out there in black. So we're gaining heat in the lab space with equipment, people, etc. Then this is taken to the chiller plant on the roof. It would typically then go to the cooling towers and then get released from the cooling towers. In this scenario, the heat released from the cooling towers is a waste of energy. The reason why this heat is typically released is because low-grade water is what's being released, and we just don't heat buildings with 120-degree hot water. But with reducing and recycling in mind, this brings us to the question, how can we use that 120-degree hot water to heat a building? Why get rid of it? What can we do with it? So this is the question that brought us to our design for 125. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So we incorporated condenser water heat recovery. So to explain this, I'm a plumbing engineer, so my mind naturally uses plumbing analogies all of the time to understand systems. So I'll let you in on what my mind first thought of. So when I think of condenser water heat recovery from a plumbing standpoint, I think about how in plumbing, a building needs a certain amount of water. Typically, we pull that in from the street services, but to offset that water usage, we could use rainwater that's captured, and then we could reuse it. So in turn with HVAC, a building needs a certain amount of cooling. You need that amount no matter what. A mechanical fun fact is that water is much more effective than air in terms of heat transfer. So instead of just using air, the remaining cooling can be obtained using water through coils. So it's a similar image to what was on that previous slide, but in the center, you're going to have people and equipment that create heat. That heat from the lab is going to go to the chiller plant. Then instead of going to the cooling tower and outside the building, the condenser water from the chiller plant will go back to the lab and provide heat at spaces that are typically cooler, like the perimeter of the building. So we typically heat with 150 to 180-degree hot water, but instead our units can now take in 120-degree condenser water and heat that up. So with this scenario, the chiller plant is the same size. However, with DOAS, we're reducing fan energy. We need a lot less air since we're also reusing water. And in turn, the size of the main ducts and shafts end up being reduced. So this strategy is particularly important for energy saving in lab buildings like 125. Lab buildings are inherently energy intensive with such a heavy interior cooling load all year long. So if we go to the next slide, we can really understand the impact that this design has on the building. So a fun little graphic here, a little confusing at first, but we'll break it down. Let's start on the right side. So internal gains, that is heat generated in a typical space from people, equipment, lights. If we follow that yellow arrow, the heat removed from the space, what do we do with that heat? So in our instance, that heat is captured through energy recovery devices. That's that green piece. The energy heat recovery is showing that we are 62% efficient in terms of capturing energy through exhaust. So that was what I mentioned before with capturing every last BTU. Then on the top, that space heat of rejection line represents that 43% of our heat generation from condenser water recovery described before reduces heat generation to only 57% steam. So we were able to almost half our heat generated with recycling. So this diagram just really shows how impactful this design is. And this was just a high level look at some of the technologies we're using at 125 West End Ave. And working with an owner with a forward thinking mindset just enabled us to embrace innovation with this best in class lab building. So thank you guys for your time, and I'll hand it over to Matt Weir for closeout.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to the rest of the team. I think we've certainly given you quite a bit of detail and our insights as to how we think of these spaces. As I said, we're very committed to this sector. We're committed to growing this sector. You see that both of the projects include collaborative spaces to embrace not only the tenants and the ecosystem within the building, but also the broader New York City ecosystem. So with that, I will turn it back to Nancy and I guess to the remainder of the panel, to the panelists. as well as the attendees, to see if there are any questions for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. What a presentation. It's really amazing what you're doing with these buildings. I have to tell you, in 2011, when we were citing the New York Genome Center, we looked at 619 West 54th Street and we evaluated it for life sciences use. And unfortunately, it was owned by another owner at that time who really didn't understand life sciences at all and wanted nothing to do with it in his building. So even though we started to negotiate a lease, we were never able to conclude one. And I'm really excited to see what's happened there since then in the last 10 years. It's really very, very extraordinary. We do have a number of comments and questions at the bottom of the screen, but I had a question actually. You know, C16 Biosciences is a different kind of life science company. They are not developing therapeutics. They're actually developing a product, which is palm oil, which goes into foods and a number of other products. And their research and manufacturing is different than it would be for a therapeutic. What you know, is there any difference in the lab space you're building out for them as a consequence?
I'll answer that high level, and I'll probably oversimplify, but you've heard the term flexibility mentioned several times, and everything that we're doing right down from the sort of basis of design that goes into informing the capacity of the infrastructure to how we lay out our pre-built labs, which is what C16, that they came into one of our pre-built lab programs. And so it's our intention with those that for a biomanufacturing or biomaterials tenant or a traditional therapeutic, one who might be biology heavy or chemistry heavy, our spaces are intended to be easily adaptable for any of those. So the short answer is we did make some tweaks, but it was really on the margin. The reason that it was suited to meet their specific needs was because of really the investment that goes in early, both on the design and engineering and in terms of the construction, thinking about what might come and how we would pivot to meet the needs. So the answer is that in its flexibility, we were able to pivot to someone that was more biomanufacturing than therapeutics. And that's how we're intending to design all of these spaces.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited about C16 Biosciences because I think they are the first of what will be a wave of similar companies, you know, because New York is the headquarters for fashion and design and food. I mean, it will become food as well. Energy, all of these things eventually will have a biological component to it.
Ag tech and climate tech.
Yeah.
We think the talent pool of New York City broadly is what will position it as the best place in the world to start these companies.
Yeah, singing to the choir. And I'm excited to have an NYC Builds Bio event on your rooftop. So let's keep that in mind. Just a couple of questions from the audience. What is the minimum tenant size you are planning to accommodate? Do you have a shared program for smaller tenants with regards to glass wash, cold storage, hazardous waste strategies, et cetera? Nate, I know you answered this in the chat, but I just wanted to raise that because I'm sure people are wondering.
Absolutely. So our 54,000 square foot plates are divisible in a few different ways, and we've tested smaller spaces in the 10,000 square foot range. And we are looking, although at this point have not yet confirmed an incubator program that would allow, of course, space to go even sort of more to a bench by bench or workspace by workspace configuration and include some of those shared services. Flexibility being the key, where we're anticipating either possibility and trying to serve as broad an ecosystem or a spectrum of the life science life cycle for these companies as possible.
Yeah, and then for 125 West End Avenue, any ideas on the ratio between wet and dry lab?
So we design with our team to a 50-50 office lab ratio and build in a little bit of redundancy to accommodate flexibility. And that's on a building systems level for core and shell infrastructure. For any particular tenant, as long as we are budgeting correctly, we can play with those ratios to meet a particular user's needs.
Okay, great. Just a few comments here, which I want your team, Matt and Nate, to hear, because I think everyone really enjoyed this presentation. Cool video, very cool video indeed. I love that. I love the tie to the DNX helix as well, beautiful. Here's a comment from one of our members who's on your team. Great and informative presentation all, and very proud to be a part of Taconic's 125 West End Avenue project design team. Signing off for now for a meeting, but before that, on behalf of my team at Langen, want to say thank you very much to Taconic and Perkins and Will teams for giving us the opportunity to help. And so I think that basically expresses, you know, the opinions of the people who have been on this call and are able to see the great presentation that you gave. So thanks so much. All of you.
Thank you. Appreciate your having us.
So now we have a few minutes left, and I'm glad that we have this flexibility of the last half hour, because the last few webinars we've had have run over because there's so much information to present now, which is really exciting. But we can drop into our engagement groups for at least 10 minutes and more if any of the rest of you can stay. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks again, Nancy.